This show is a Hopful Media podcast production.
Hey, History of Persia fans. Before Persia, another civilization controlled the Middle East. The very first civilization, the inventors of writing itself. From the clay tablets of ancient Mesopotamia come the oldest stories. The history and myth of the first Mesopotamians is the subject of the Oldest Stories podcast online at oldeststories.net. If you like ancient history, come check out the Oldest Stories after you listen to this episode.
The history of Persia is intertwined with conquest. It began with conquest when Cyrus, king of a small city called Anshan, set out to build the greatest empire the world had ever seen. In a series of stunning campaigns, he achieved just that, becoming one of the greatest conquerors in history, and basically started Persian history. After all, you don't get the title the Great for nothing. But he wouldn't be the last great Persian conqueror. Other Persian rulers like Darius the Great, Mithridates I, and Ardashir I would go on to become great conquerors on their own, establishing their own great empires and legacies. If you want to hear their story, and the stories of other great conquerors, many of whom are far less famous despite their great achievements, join me, Ramzi Shalah, on my podcast, The Conquerors Podcast, available on all platforms you listen through.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to America's Secret Wars. This is a podcast all about forgotten, overlooked, and deliberately buried times the United States has used military force to fight or occupy foreign nations. I am your host, Trevor Cully, and I am once again joined by Bailey and Nick from Totalis Jeffianus. How are you both?
Hello.
We're doing just swell.
Absolutely stellar.
We're in the after times of the annexation of us, so
It's good to be an American.
And we are not entirely sure when this will come out, but it will definitely be in the new administration.
Yeah, the Fourth Reich.
a non-zero chance I'll be singing is proud to be an American, and at least I'm free.
The worst of all of our patriotic music.
Yeah, that one sucks. They all suck, to be fair. But
there's the one the one that Woody Guthrie wrote was originally like a really cool song, and then he cut out the cool verses because he didn't think it would sell as well. But his guitar killed fascists, so that's cool.
Oh, hell yeah.
Yeah, you know what? He's okay. Oh, this land is your land.
Yes, that's the one.
That one's fire. He can stay.
Yeah, there we go. The only half-decent patriotic American song, because it started out as not being patriotic.
Not even a little bit.
My other favorite American history song is Luang Prabang, the song about getting your genitals blown off in Vietnam.
Ooh.
Hell yeah.
All right, as I said, this is part 3 of our series on the Anglo-American border crises of the 1800s. And possibly the 2020s. Last time we talked about Aroostook War and the near conflict over the Maine New Brunswick border, including a battle against the living spirit of Mother Nature, a black bear wandering through the woods.
Yep.
And before that, we talked about the Republic of Indian Stream, a quasi-independent disputed territory in what is now Pittsburgh, New Hampshire, with its weird constitution.
It's fire constitution.
Still no deaths, though, right? Like, you're picking this up like it's a bunch of wars, but no casualties yet.
People died because they were in military camps during the Aroostook War.
Yeah, but that doesn't look good in a movie.
Like, it's not documented, but I am sure that lumberjack that got mauled by a bear didn't last for very long after that, even if he did get to go home from the initial bear attack.
Yeah, but that means it's going to be comedic relief. He will live in the show. It'll just be a comedy.
Well, I've got good news for you, Bailey. Bailey has been asking for 2 episodes now for more death and battle.
He's thirsting for blood.
And this is going to be the high watermark of that for this series.
Nice.
And episode 4 will not be nearly as comedic relief, even if, well, depending on how you look at it, slightly fewer or incalculably more people will die in the next episode.
Great.
Wow.
His bloodlust shall be satiated.
That's your teaser for an episode that deals with the United States going into the 1850s.
Ooh.
We're getting there then.
Yeah, we are on our way.
Yeah. Quickly marching.
Today, we are continuing the story of the US and the British colony of Lower Canada arguing over who owned which specific strips of border.
Yes.
Always border disputes with these two countries, man.
Yeah, just constantly.
And it's only these 2 countries that have border disputes.
No, nobody else.
Honestly, I think we should just get rid of these 2 borders and make it one whole thing, and then no countries will have borders.
Well, there's a little bit of a funny thing about that in this episode.
Bailey called it.
So this is a more dynamic theater of the conflict around the Great Lakes.
Bailey, that's where Bailey grew up.
Big up Lake Ontario.
I am curious to know how much of this history you've heard before.
Oh, well, in history class, we only learned about American history, so not Canadian history.
Well, then definitely not. Have you ever heard of the Caroline Affair?
Yeah.
No.
Not much about it. I have heard about it. I've heard of it.
Yeah, it's a thing that you might have heard of because it's like important to international law in general, even if you don't know like why it happened.
I pay the littlest amount of attention to everything. That's what I'm very good at.
Have either of you ever heard of the Patriot War?
Yes, again.
It rings a bell.
Okay, great. So like we're in the realm of things that might have been brought up at some point.
Yeah. But the Confederacy also probably they probably called their war that, though, admittedly. The Confederacy. They probably called it the Patriot.
Yeah, fair enough. This is the Canadian Patriot War.
Oh, then I don't think so.
So this is actually the kind of culmination of a series of rebellions and revolutions that swept through both sides of the Atlantic, beginning with the American and French revolutions.
Trendsetters.
In 1837, Britain vaguely claimed the authority to colonize all of modern Canada, but it was practically limited to the coasts, the Great Lakes, and the major river basins.
Right.
Just because if you look at a geographic map of North America, there's a whole lot of nothing in the middle that's really hard to get through.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Trees and stuff.
Yeah, it's like the steppe in Central Europe. Like there's a reason that you needed to get engines and guns before you could bring like nation states there.
Yeah.
On the east coast of modern Canada, you had the maritime colonies, Newfoundland, Nova Scotia, and New Brunswick, and some tiny ones. After defeating the French in the 7 Years' War, they split the French colony in half, making Upper Canada along the Great Lakes in modern Ontario and Lower Canada along the St. Lawrence River in modern Quebec.
Which is crazy because, like, Quebec's higher up than...
Well, so it was upriver, downriver. That's the one thing I remember from history class in high school.
And weirdly enough, that's a thing that goes back all the way to ancient Egypt. Like...
Yeah.
It's going the wrong way.
Yeah, whenever you're wondering what's the deal with upper and lower regions being on the wrong part of the map, that terminology is older than maps. That's how that works.
It's the fact that, like, technically speaking, we look at our world on a map and think that that's the right way up, even though we could just be upside down. We're just in space.
We're a floating ball in space where there is no direction.
I thought we were a floating disc.
I thought we were a frisbee.
I live on the ice wall myself.
A floating disc on top of the backs of 4 elephants on top of the backs of a flying turtle.
Exactly.
Right. Yeah, I know how this works.
Thank you. Thank you for being respectful in this time.
So today's events begin with the American Revolution. And not just because this is a very US centric podcast, and basically every story begins with the American Revolution.
So it's an important event, admittedly.
When the entire conceit of the podcast is world history as told through the US kicking down everybody else's front door, like, it plays a role.
Yeah.
But in fact, it would be just as fair to start with the Americans' own inspiration in things like the English Civil War or Pontiac's rebellion in North America. But I have to draw a line somewhere, and American independence did mark the beginning of a dramatic and consistent political shift for the whole Atlantic. This was toward one of two things, depending on which angle you look at it from. If you looked over at the Americans of 1776 from a similar socioeconomic position, it was a liberal Republican uprising against monarchy, unfair taxation, and an outdated system where money could not buy you everything you wanted.
America.
Yeah.
If you look at it from anything underneath of that status, the American Revolution presented itself as a revolt for freedom against tyrannical oppressors who extracted your value unfairly.
Yep, America.
On one hand, you inspire the French Revolution, and on the other, you get liberatory revolts like the Haitian Revolution. Neither is a wholly incorrect way to interpret things, but the liberal capitalist way of looking at it is objectively more correct. That is the type of person who was doing the American Revolution.
Yeah.
The US was not a liberatory state. See slavery.
Yeah.
America, at least after being, the forefather of revolting against the nation, they then helped other nations also rebel and did not just subjugate them when they tried.
This is, yes.
For example, Vietnam.
Yes, clearly
Philippines.
those are the most relevant examples.
Canada.
But also, Canada, tons of the Spanish language revolutions, like that was actually a big thing. People are complicated, and groups of millions of people are more complicated. So by the 1830s, this wave of liberal Republican virtue was starting to die down. Spain had mostly given up on the American mainland, and its colonies were still fighting their own civil wars, but mostly among themselves. In Europe, new people and types of people were starting to get involved in radical politics, demanding crazy things like universal suffrage, the abolition of slavery, serfdom, and rights for working people.
Insanity.
On that side of the Atlantic, the political shift would congeal into the great revolutionary soup that was the year 1848. Today's story falls squarely in the middle of these two revolutionary waves. Geographically and temporally, it obviously ties to the liberal enlightenment behind things like the American and French Revolution. Politically, the revolutionaries today at least preached something a lot like the British Chartists, who were the more milquetoast version of the 1848 revolutionaries in Britain. Not to discredit their attempted revolution in Wales, but that didn't pan out. And in that regard, they are kind of the bridge between the French, American, Haitian bourgeois revolutions and the more working class communist revolutions that come afterwards.
Yeah.
This is where we get to the part where Trevor had to learn about the entire history of Canadian Senate politics.
Ooh.
How is that?
I'll be honest, I think there's a reason we studied like American history in my history class and not Canadian history. I think we're about to find out why.
Yeah, I feel that strongly after having to do this. Canada followed most of the same trends as the UK when it came to the increasing power of the lower house legislature and the prime minister, while decreasing the power of the nobility and the monarchy. So modern Canadian senators are technically appointed by the British King's Governor General, But they're chosen by the PM for life or until a mandatory retirement age at 75.
Yes.
The US might consider looking into something like that for our own government.
Yeah, like 65, 60.
I saw this post today, and it was
48, you know.
there was this old woman who was at an airport somewhere, and she thought the baggage claim like carousel was the way to get on the plane. So she just like sat on it, and the top comment was, "Someone get her in the government," and I can't stop thinking about it.
Yeah. Well, they did misplace the head of the U.S. House Appropriations Committee, the most important subgroup of our entire legislature, in a retirement home in the dementia ward this past year. So
Really?
that's where we're at.
Yeah.
That's insane.
I wish I could say I'm shocked, but here we are.
So prior to 1987, Canadian Senate appointments were just for life. And prior to 1867, when Canada started to become more of its own country, the Senate was called the Legislative Assembly, and the Prime Minister was much less involved in the selection process.
Yeah, but he was also Scottish, so.
We're going to get to that.
Bailey's jumping the gun.
We're actually going to get more to an Irish tie, but the Scots are in here too. In fact, those legislative assembly members had to be approved by British Parliament. But we have to go even further back to 1791, when there were still two Canadas, each with their own legislative assembly chosen by the British. And the governor's cabinet was called the Executive Assembly.
I didn't even know there was two Canadas, I'll be honest.
Upper Canada, Lower Canada.
Yeah, I know, like before this podcast episode.
Oh.
I did not realize there was two.
I paid attention in 9th grade.
Well, a ton of this series is just everyone trying to decide whether or not that should be the case.
Right.
Yeah.
Honestly, we're still fighting that now. Like, Quebec is still trying to secede, like, every 4 years.
It is amusing to me when they're like, we want to become part of France, and France is like, absolutely not.
You heathens, get away.
Yeah, and they're so convinced that they want it so bad. France is just going to welcome you with open arms. Like, girl, have you met yourself? I wouldn't let you in.
Quebec was like, well, like, we could, like, make it really cheap trade. And it's like, yeah, we already got cheap trade with France. That's already what that is.
You know, I bet you the Canadian government could con the U.S. into taking just Quebec.
No takesies backsies, you touched it last.
We're going to talk about Quebec some today. The Legislative Assembly was basically intended to be a Canadian House of Lords, appointed by the Crown with the ability to throw out any laws passed by the elected representatives in the lower house. Technically speaking, your modern Senate can still do this, but much like the House of Lords, they usually don't, because it looks bad when centrally appointed aristocrats do that kind of thing.
No.
Yeah.
Then again, like, the House of Lords in Britain keeps, like, shutting down really terrible bills, so there's something there.
I think, like, I know they have shut down a bill in, like, not recent history, but in the last, like, 50 years, the Senate said no, and it was a big hoopla, and everyone was like, stop doing that, and they're like, we're the Senate, we can, and everyone's like, no, you're just supposed to sit there.
Yeah, that's what you're for. That's what we should have done to our Senate, and instead we made them more powerful.
Yeah.
This was not the case in the 1800s. Though they were technically separate governments, the largely Francophone Lower Canadians had different concerns than their more British neighbors in Upper Canada, but the structure was very similar.
Yeah.
Their respective houses of assembly were dominated by elected members of the merchant and business class. Weirdly, often allied with the descendants of French aristocrats in Lower Canada. The assemblies were controlled by British aristocratic conservative Tories that were dominated by a handful of extremely wealthy families closely allied with the provincial governors.
I can't see that party collapsing.
No, never. Graft and bribery were rampant. The legislative assemblies routinely threw out any legislation that threatened their personal standings. It was, a mild absolute monarchy.
You know what?
Seems healthy.
Yeah.
It was an aristocracy.
That I think that's completely sustainable and there's nothing wrong with that.
Yeah.
Clearly.
Yeah. Definitely.
I'm compressing about 50 years of political infighting into as little space as possible here, so bear with me.
It's fine.
And we're mostly going to focus on Upper Canada today, since that's where the US got most involved. But the politics of both Canadas were intrinsically tied together. These aristocratic cliques controlled the banks, the major land speculation companies, the legal system, and had the backing of both the Anglican and Catholic clergy. There was basically nothing the lower house of the legislature could do aside from beg and protest.
Which the French are good at.
Yeah.
Yes. Though these are all the people who left France before they got all of that revolutionary training. So maybe that's why this doesn't work as well.
Yeah. They were just cosplaying as
there's a that's more accurate than I wish it was. In Lower Canada, the Quebecois French resented the top-down push toward Anglicization. In Upper Canada, the Anglo-Canadians resented restrictions against American immigrants and businesses who might stand a chance of competing with the family compact that dominated the appointed councils. Trade restrictions and the growing importance of timber collection at the expense of local agriculture started making everything more expensive and putting people out of work in both provinces.
That's why they got to work together.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure that was a popular...
They did not. Protests in and out of the lower houses in both started almost as soon as the two provinces were established in 1791 and continued for decades, stopping briefly to fight the Americans during the War of 1812. And these resentments were the exact reason that a lot of Americans thought they might be able to annex Canada at the time.
Yeah, because Canada was seeming very divided and weak. And it was, I know for the, was it Madison? I don't know. It seemed like a really opportune time. And the UK was also at war with France at the time as well, right?
Yeah, they were fighting Napoleon.
Yeah, so it just seemed like, what are they going to do? We're just going to run up there, take everything. They're not going to be able to mount anything.
And what they're going to do is light the White House on fire.
They still, they lit the White House on fire, but Americans did destroy the entire capital of Canada, or at least, I guess, Greater Canada. Or
whatever. Ontario. But you know who doesn't support a small aristocratic clique controlling all of the banks? Actually, this isn't true. This is an ad transition, so they probably do. But yes, this is where ads will go in the future.
Hello and bonjour. My name is Josh Zucker, and I want to take you on a journey through some of the most exciting events of the late Middle Ages. Valois-Burgundy was one of the medieval world's greatest what-ifs. Its dukes inherited, conquered, and politicked their way into forging a state between the German Empire and the Kingdom of France that rivaled them both. From the 100 Years' War to the Holy Roman Empire, from urban workers to Joan of Arc, and from gallant knights to gunpowder weapons, the Grand Dukes of the West had a part to play in almost all of Western Europe's biggest developments in the 14th and 15th centuries. If you want to learn more about the glamorous rise and dramatic fall of the Dukes of Burgundy, please join me for Grand Dukes of the West, A History of Valois-Burgundy.
Cats. And on that note, we're back.
Yeah.
No, listeners, you don't get to know the context for why I just shouted that. So from here, we fast forward to 1832 and the reform protests in Montreal, ending with the British Army fatally shooting 3 protesters in the street.
Bailey!
Oh, bonjour, monsieur! Oh,
People died, Bailey!
yes! Nice! And it was French people?
Bailey just cheering for the shedding of Quebecois blood.
He doesn't care who died. He's just happy someone did.
Oh, we're talking about history. Oh. Sorry, I just don't like Quebecois.
You're married to one.
Tabernacle.
It's a resentment every day.
Yeah, well.
I said not on the podcast. So this prompted the Quebecois-dominated Parti Patriot to submit a list of 92 grievances to the Assembly, which they passed as an official act 2 years later as the 92 resolutions.
I remember this.
Outlining all of their complaints against the governor and the councils.
He likes his soup too hot. No opening stores on Mondays.
Shot 3 of my friends in the street.
Yeah, just all the grievances.
After reviewing the resolutions, the Legislative Assembly of Lower Canada and their governor chose to do nothing.
Yep.
Good. You know what? I always found that doing nothing in a situation where something needs to be done is usually the best option.
Yeah, that usually solves things, right?
It's like kicking. Yeah. It's like kicking the can down the road. We always know kicking the can down the road never has effects that come back to haunt you.
Major national uprising calling for police reform. What if we just wait it out? Things like that.
They'll calm down.
Yeah. When America's great again, they'll calm down.
Yes. They'll go back to the office eventually. It'll be fine. At the same time, a guy named Francis Bond Head became Governor General in Upper Canada. He promptly started fucking around in ways that were guaranteed to result in finding out.
That was one of the smoothest.
That was good.
Head I can't call him Head. I can't call him Francis. This dick ignored and overruled his own executive council, the cabinet that he appointed, so flagrantly that they just resigned.
Oof.
And he employed members of the Loyal Orange Order to engage in street violence against reformist assembly candidates to stack even the elected legislature, which his appointees could overturn in his favor.
Sorry, what? The what?
The Loyal Orange Order.
Oh, so it's, come on.
Have you heard of the Loyal Orange Order, Bailey?
Yeah, they're MAGA supporters. Come on.
If you could drag them forward in time, this isn't even particularly relevant, but the fact that they show up is just kind of on the bingo card at this point, because they are an Anglican Protestant fraternal order and or secret society, better known for coloring in 1/3 of the Irish flag.
Y'all, Canadian history is just fake.
I hate that.
Now, this is a weird thing about talking about just about anywhere in the 1800s is somehow, some way, Irish people are going to show up. I did an episode with Roberto from Czar Power on the Opium War. And this didn't make it into the episode because we were already busy. But Irish exiles served the Taiping Rebellion in China as their primary executioners.
What the hell?
They just show up. So the Loyal Orange Order got their start and most of their infamy as the paramilitary wing of British colonial rule in Ireland.
Ooh.
So we have an unexpected pro-colonial domination cameo by the guys whose fraternal brothers in Ulster were being investigated by the British government in the 1830s for a wave of deadly violence.
Yeah, that's so odd because it's like you're they're going against like everything their country as a solo, not a part of England country would stand against.
Yeah, you'd think, but these were the Unionists who were mostly British people who had lived in Ireland for a couple generations.
How violent do you have to be investigated by Britain in the 1800s?
By the British colonial government. It's like Christopher Columbus being such a monster that he was investigated by the Spanish fucking Inquisition.
I know they say no one expects the Spanish Inquisition, haha, funny, but I feel like we got to start saying that about Irish people in history, from what I've heard.
Well, speaking of horrible monsters in history, all of this Canadian business intersected with American politics in 1836 when the genocidal warlord that I cannot get rid of on this show, President Andrew Genocide fucking Jackson, vetoed the charter for the Second Bank of the United States.
Hey, I'll have you know he was a real patriot.
I'm not going to argue with that. I'm just not going to say it was a good thing. This led to the bank's collapse, along with all of its investments, credit lines, and most of the United States' financial regulations, which in turn caused an economic depression for the US and all of its main trading partners, including the British and Canadians. This just added more financial strain brought on by land speculation and import restrictions, plus a poor harvest in Canada. Francis Head and the Legislative Council responded to this by subsidizing the banks and making it easier to sue indebted farmers or send them to prison.
It always works when you send the people producing your food to prison for debts that they can't pay off while they're in prison.
Yeah, I don't see how could this go badly.
Yeah, it's not like a mass famine appear out of nowhere.
No. Similar things were happening in Lower Canada as well. So the Upper Canadian Reform Party and the Lower Canadian Parti Patriot started communicating with one another. They were basically saying, we've got to do something about all of this. Maybe we ought to stockpile arms and ammunition. Both provinces' patriot parties started organizing paramilitaries, and the Upper Canadian reformers set up their own cottage blacksmith industry manufacturing pikes.
We have guns now, right? Like, when are we? We're definitely like age of
1830s, so it's still muskets. You're still getting a lot of bayonet charges in warfare. Close that gap, pikes probably have an advantage.
Pikes also are notoriously not shielded at all by they don't have a shield. It's usually just a big pike with a...
Sure, but neither do guns. And everyone's given up on armor at this point.
Bullets, they go far. I don't care how big your pike is. It's not handling. It can't go up against my Glock, look, buddy.
Some of you may die, but that is a risk the party is willing to take.
And it's stuff that on this podcast we want to see. So
yes.
So we is doing a lot of heavy lifting.
Bailey craves the blood of the Quebecois. So through the second half of 1837, the Upper Canadian reformists were more focused on planning, although one faction was intending to kidnap the governor.
Oh, from last week.
God, I love these people. Everything can be solved by kidnapping some guy.
Wasn't that also what happened last time?
Last time they kidnapped
the mayor.
Last time they kidnapped a Canadian sheriff and a whole company of militia, which might be considered just, taking hostages in combat.
The entire militia wakes up one day in a completely different place. How did we get here? We've been captured overnight.
The plans to kidnap the governor did not go through, in part because tensions in Lower Canada escalated too rapidly. After winning a significant majority in the Assembly in 1836, the Patriots began escalating their series of protests and riots, going out into the streets and accosting prominent loyalists in major cities. This culminated in the formation of the Confederation of the Six Counties, a governing body for French Canadian patriots, and their paramilitary arm, the Société des Filles de la Libertés, or to put that in American, the Society of the Sons of Liberty, taking direct inspiration from the Americans' revolutionary paramilitary organization of the same name.
The Sons of Liberty. Yeah, I was going to say that's really recognizable.
Yeah, they were very directly saying we are like those guys.
And you know what? Like, I'll be honest though, like in something such a big event, it's hard not to see why people thought that of themselves.
Yeah, of course.
Because especially when you feel like you're going up against a bigger government and it feels like you've got all the weight coming down on you, you're going to feel like you're liberating freedom or whatever.
Yeah, absolutely. Like they wanted to do a revolution. And if they were going to do that, people who really liked the name Sons of Liberty were right next door and not getting along with their government at the time.
I mean, Fille de la Liberté does sound fire in French, to be fair.
Oh, imagine chanting that out. That would be amazing. French, that's what I'll give. French, like, chants sound really good. It's almost like it's a poetic language.
Yeah.
You got to think about it in this way too. They have been rioting for so long at this point that it has genuinely affected the development of their language.
Yeah.
But as they'll tell you, they speak real French, and people in France are backwards with the way they speak. That is real, by the way. That is real. That is a thing.
I mean, honestly, I kind of appreciate that because the French government needs a whole government department to be like, no, that's not real French.
Yeah.
Which isn't historically how a language works.
Yeah.
Of course, with a name like Sons of Liberty, none of this was particularly subtle, and the provincial governments started making plans to summon their own militia.
Yeah, it also sounds like a type of group that you'd have while also like convincing other people that the reprehensible things that you're doing are for a reason.
Yeah, absolutely. And at this point, they're mostly protesting and breaking stuff in the streets, but like they're not carrying out acts of terrorism.
Yeah, not yet.
Really. The government didn't want to spark a conflict accidentally by arming their own soldiers. Instead, groups like the Orange Order and the so-called Doric Club in Lower Canada formed their own paramilitary street fighter organizations.
You got to choose. All right, there's 3 groups you could be a part of. All right, hear me out. Listen to all 3 before you get there. We got the the Loyalty Orange group. We got the Sons of Liberty. You know you're on the wrong side of history so easily in this.
Yeah, the Doric Club, which is either a reference to an obscure Scots dialect that might have been spoken by their founder, or to the ancient Spartans,
which were Scots,
clashed with the Sun.
If you've watched 300, they are Scottish.
Obviously,
this all makes sense.
Yeah. If a movie came out 20 to 30 years ago and featured a guy screaming about freedom with his shirt off, same groups of people.
Yeah.
So the Doric Club and the Sons of Liberty fought in the streets of Montreal, resulting in mass violence, rioting, and vandalism, which prompted arrest warrants to be issued for just the Patriot leadership.
Of course.
That was on November 6th, 1837.
Well, they started all those riots, so...
Yeah, they caused the riots. It definitely didn't have anything to do with the ultra-nationalist street fighters.
Why would it have anything to do with them? I don't even know why you're bringing them up right now. It feels like you're just trying to like absolve these people of blame and they really need to be held accountable right now. So
If they were really on the right side, they wouldn't have got beat up in the streets.
Obviously, and fortunately, a group of people protesting and rioting over their civil rights have never been attacked by ultra-nationalist paramilitaries with the tacit support of the local government ever again.
Not that I can think of.
No, never. And I think that's the beautiful thing about history is that we learn from it.
Yeah.
Yes, we learned so many lessons.
A small short man with a funny mustache learned that lesson too.
Oh boy. It has to happen eventually in every series. It's fine.
Yeah.
You just wait till ours, Nick. It's brutal.
Okay.
The Jeff in Berlin in 1936. In this case, 26 Patriots were armed when they were confronted by British troops under the command of Lieutenant General John Colborne, the commander-in-chief for all of British North America at the time. This led to a shootout, giving time for most of the party leadership to flee Montreal to safe houses in the countryside. And a few days later, 3 Patriot leaders were arrested in Saint-Jean.
Saint-Jean, you say?
Yes.
Never heard of it.
It's in Quebec.
Yeah,
it's written Saint-Jean. For those of us who speak a language that actually uses its letters. The thing is, and this should be a familiar story at this point in the series, the constable transporting these 3 was intercepted on the road by 150 armed supporters.
Prison Break at this time as a show would have been way different.
Just one grumpy old cop with 3 guys in a wagon, and then 100 people with guns run out of the woods. So this jailbreak bolstered rebel spirits, but also led to concerns because they really were not prepared to fight the regular army. Despite that, when 200 British regulars arrived in Saint-Denis on November 23rd, they were met by 200 musket-wielding rebel militia and about 600 other people with a combination of hastily made pikes and farm tools. The rebels reinforced a barn so well that when the British shot a cannon at it, it had no effect other than creating a big, loud target for the rebels to shoot at.
That's fire.
Well, when they repositioned,
right,
the British found that the Patriot pikemen were stationed behind a massive earthwork fortification like it was ancient Macedonia.
Not flammable, though, so it's fine.
Even though they were poorly armed, the rebels so thoroughly outnumbered the British here that they were forced to retreat. They fired 60 cannonballs into various defenses and only killed a dozen people.
Wow.
British estimates range as high as over 70 killed and wounded, and 6 people just missing, who we might assume switched sides.
Yeah.
I mean, they might have had all of their fancy British guns and stuff, but we had heart.
Yeah. Well, you see this exact same thing during the American Revolution, where it's just the British's like kind of superiority, so much so that they feel like even in the face of massive odds against them, if they just robotically walk towards the enemy will just run away. It's such a well-oiled machine. It's so freaky to see a cannon hit the enemy lines, but they just step over where you just hit. A few times they get called on their bluff.
The funny thing about that cannon is also it got stuck in the mud during the retreat and then had to be destroyed so the rebels couldn't capture artillery.
so they not only went in there and suffered more losses than they thought, they also ended up having to destroy their own cannons.
Yeah, they had to destroy their own cannon, and they suffered like an almost 40% casualty rate.
That's not great.
No,
it's terrible.
If I saw those odds on like a work employment job, I'm not doing it.
For comparison, the rebel casualty rate at the same time was less than 2%.
Yeah.
And also that 2% also becomes void when 6 new people
Right.
entered your camp.
Right. They make up half of their total losses just with the deserters.
They went into the battle and gained 3 people. So
Yeah.
So this was the Battle of Saint Denis, and it really got the ball rolling. James Fitzgibbon, a prominent loyalist and veteran commander, started begging Francis Bond Head to call up the militia in Upper Canada, as most of their regular army withdrew to reinforce their comrades in the north. Still afraid of sparking a rebellion unnecessarily, the governor refused. When more actionable threats arrived on December 2nd, Fitzgibbon was appointed general of the provincial militia, but it was too little too late. It did turn out that the Battle of Saint Denis was a fluke, and between a general lack of respect for the militia and most of the party Patriots' leadership escaping to either the US or France, the lower Canadian rebels could not hold it together. They were rapidly pushed back in 3 battles over the course of the next 2.5 weeks. Lower Canada was placed under martial law, and the entire rebel force was killed or captured in Saint Eustache, I think is how it's pronounced, on December 14th.
How's it spelled?
Eustache.
Eustache.
Eustache, sure. Again, I speak a language with letters.
I don't have time for all of those things.
Yeah.
I just skip over them.
It's just it's freaky how like the British can do that, where they can just go from like a terrible loss just to being like, you know what, maybe we should like care a little bit. Even just like the slight bit of caring, they just clean up.
Yeah, as soon as they take something seriously.
Even vaguely seriously. It's like France is the only nation they really have to take it seriously. Everyone else, it's like, yeah.
And by the time France got involved in the American Revolution, Britain had already learned their lesson about where they should draw that line.
Yeah.
Yeah.
By this point, Upper Canada had fallen into a more disastrous sort of open revolt. The first few days of December 1837 were marked by clashes between roving bands of loyalist and patriot militia in the streets of Toronto, with kidnappings, gunfights, and riots counting down the days before government forces besieged the rebel headquarters in a place called Montgomery's Tavern. So they were just like, they were working out of a bar.
You could tell. All right, before we work on our game plan, I think we do another round of shots for the table.
When the tavern was attacked, the rebels dispersed and fled while the loyalists burned the building to the ground. But on the exact same day, Patriot rebels in London, Ontario, took up arms to seize control of their city. So the loyalist forces had to march over to London from Toronto.
Oh, sorry. As someone who's taken the car ride from London to Toronto, and that being like a 3-hour car ride, imagine having to march that way. God.
Right, you have to walk.
Hell no. Not paved roads. It's just you're walking through the brush.
Fortunately for these presumably exhausted redcoats, the rebels were outnumbered and fled to Scotland, also Ontario.
What?
Oh, okay.
I was gonna say a little bit of a over exaggeration on how far you need to go.
I was like fine with London because like I have a friend who goes to Western. I know about London, but like Scotland caught me by surprise.
It might be this episode. There's another point in here where it's just infuriating how many place names are just other place names.
Yeah, I mean, my hometown is Surrey. We live in New Westminster.
Yeah, the chunk of Illinois that's 100% named after other more famous places at least gives me the benefit of they're all pronounced differently.
Ah, yeah, no.
We do live in British Columbia.
Yes. We'll be talking about that eventually. In Scotland, Ontario, there was a small battle, which was really more of a gunfight. But by then, the militia was all worked up. The loyalists burned down any home or farm even remotely connected to the rebels in Scotland. All in all, the rebellion was actually holding its own in Upper Canada. In the Battle of Montgomery's Tavern, 210 rebels armed with outdated muskets and homemade pikes squared off with a full British regiment, and only 3 rebels died.
Okay.
Oh, hell yeah.
1 British soldier was killed and 5 were wounded on either side.
Can we try at least?
Yeah.
What's going on?
The issue here was that 8 casualties is a much larger percentage of 210 than 6 out of 1,000.
True.
Yeah.
Fortunately for the Upper Canadian Patriots, Toronto, Scotland, and London were all a lot closer to an international border than Montreal or Saint-Denis. And the rebel leaders, along with about 200 of their followers, just hopped into the Niagara River, specifically Navy Island.
Do we know the leader of the any of the leaders of this rebellion here?
We are getting to that.
Okay, so is it of Scotland? Is it William Wallace by any chance?
It is William something.
I knew it.
Okay, but if you're saying back in 18 something, if you're like, okay, well, is the guy at the head named William? Like you're throwing a handful of darts at a board, some of them are gonna land.
Yeah, but the face paint, he had face paint too, I'm guessing. Blue face paint.
I will be curious to see how you react to the leader of the rebellion's name. Let me just say that.
I will like it.
I'm so excited. Bailey's decided he will like it.
There were 24 refugee politicians who went to Navy Island and declared themselves the Independent Republic of Canada.
Nice.
We are 3 for 3 on Weird Little Republic so far.
That always works.
New country.
They elected a longtime reform politician named William Lyon Mackenzie as their new president.
No,
know
that's
that
fire.
guy. You know that guy.
Is that Lyon?
Yes.
Yeah.
William was born in Scotland. His recent ancestors, like his grandparents, were actually clan nobility, but they had sided with the Bonnie Prince Charlie during the final Jacobite revolt in Britain and fell on hard times. By William's day, they had very little money, and in a twist for 18th century history, his mother was a widowed goat herd, and his father was a weaver 17 years younger than his wife.
Okay, you know what, Slay?
Sadly, William's dad got sick, went blind, and died within a couple weeks of their son's birth.
Oh.
That's the dad.
That's not ideal.
But it's just such a reverse of roles for the time.
Yeah.
The older woman marries the younger man, and somehow the man dies in childbirth.
What?
He was all right. I am neutral on my thoughts about William Mackenzie, but he's okay right now.
Just a question. Is he related to William Lyon Mackenzie King?
Give me a paragraph.
Okay, sorry. I was like, oh yes, why is the actual Prime Minister of Canada revolting right now?
So some of their wealthier relatives were able to pull strings and get William an education. They moved to Alyth in 1813 to open a general store, and court records show that he had to pay a fine for having a son out of wedlock during his time there.
Ah, that dirty dog.
Fine. A fine is kind of crazy.
You got that girl pregnant, you gotta pay 30 pounds. Like,
that's not a punishment, that's a price tag.
So the post-Napoleonic recession bankrupted their family store, and at 19, William struck out on his own, moved to southern England, and became a degenerate drunk and gambler with all of his remaining savings, until a friend convinced him to move to Canada. He thrived in the colonies, took odd jobs as a bookkeeper and a journalist in Montreal before moving to Upper Canada to help his friends open a new store. Then he saved up enough money to have his mom, his son, and a girl his mom really wanted William to marry emigrate.
Great. I'm glad she's coming along.
Yes. Her name was Isabel Baxter, and she had been a casual acquaintance of the family up to that point. They did get married, and over the next couple of decades, they had 13 children together.
Yep.
Now, Bailey, you did notice Willie's full name. Do you want to tell the American audience why William Lyon Mackenzie stood out to you?
Because one of our original prime ministers, if not, is it the first?
No,
No.
John A. McDonald, my guy.
Oh, McDonald, yeah. But he is a future prime minister, and he goes on to be our prime minister for 25 years.
I mean, he did predate John A. So,
But one of William and Isabel's daughters married a lawyer named John King. And one of the resulting grandchildren was William Lyon Mackenzie King, who did, as you said, go on to become the Prime Minister of Canada during World War II.
Oh, okay. That's pretty recently.
So in just 3 generations of this family, we bridged the gap from fucking Napoleon to Hitler.
yeah. And that's on term limits.
See, and I feel like this is a good time to tell you that Nick's battled with for a long time is placing Napoleon in history.
Yeah, to me, I think I said this on literally our podcast. It's the same thing to me as cowboys and samurais existing at the same time. Anytime Napoleon is mentioned, I'm like, no, he's not. He was in
yeah.
He's with Bach in 1550, guys. Figure it out. That's where he is in my head.
One of those figures that just seems older.
I think my only real knowledge of Napoleon does come from Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure, and
there is to some degree an argument that he was the last medieval warlord.
That's his vibes. His vibes to me are that he's in a Baroque court doing his little dance,
Yeah, he is a warlord. People don't just it's the modern era. You don't just go invading other countries.
Right. He's kind of the last guy to get away with doing that without making up pretenses.
Right. Okay. Yeah. He just, exactly. Well, he didn't even have a reason. He was just let's just do it.
Right. A ton of World War II was at least premised on, no, that's rightfully ancestral German territory.
Whether right or wrong, it was a reason that they had.
Yeah. They had to come up with a reason to invade somewhere. Napoleon was like, I want Russia.
I want that.
Sir, you have France is pretty big right now.
I'm going to take it.
Gimme, give.
I still hate that Napoleon's brother's name is Jerome.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Is it really?
Yeah, Jerome Bonaparte. He was he was pretty big in the Mexican Revolution.
The relationship between Bonapartes and Mexico is really weird, but we don't have time for that. So after getting married, the Mackenzies moved again, and William started his own newspaper, a vocally pro-reform track called the Colonial Advocate. He leveraged that into a campaign for the Legislative Assembly and became a leading figure in the Patriot movement, which eventually led to his involvement in the revolt and election as president on Navy Island in 1837. Hello, everybody. This is Trevor Cully, host of the History of Persia podcast. From about 550 to 330 BC, most of the Middle East was ruled by the Achaemenid Persians. The Achaemenids pioneered the concept of a truly multinational empire, which incorporated people from as far away as India and Greece for over 200 years. The story of Persia discusses the fall of ancient civilizations, the origins of endurance racing, 300 Spartans, the March of the 10,000, and at least one evil priest who replaced and impersonated the king. All before falling with the dramatic close at Alexander the Great's conquests. If that story, and the story of the cultures that surround it, sound interesting to you, check out The History of Persia at historyofpersiapodcast.com, or wherever you find your favorite podcasts. But a few days before William Lyon Mackenzie was elected president of Canada, he crossed the river and rode to Buffalo, New York, where he gave a fiery speech calling for American aid to the rebel cause. That's where he linked up with an American named Rensselaer von Rensselaer.
All right, okay. So you're telling me we're not in the Baroque period. I'm sorry. Like, I don't know a whole lot.
Remember, New York used to be Dutch.
Okay. All right, you know what? I'm choosing to keep my peace.
Yeah, his name is Rensselaer von Rensselaer. The Rensselaers were one of the oldest, wealthiest, and most militarily experienced families in New York, and William Mackenzie wanted, let's call him RVR, to help raise an American militia to invade Canada.
RVR.
The plan...
This summer, coming out with our new RVR. You'll be gliding around the country.
When I first read the name, I thought it was a typo.
It's gotta so I work at a divorce law firm, which means I have to read a lot of children's names. And I was thinking today, I was like, what if like somebody had the same first name as last name? Haha, that would be crazy. I had that thought today.
Well, here we are.
Foreshadowing is a narrative device.
The foreshadowing of your own mind to your own life.
Yeah. Exactly. Which just proves that I'm a psychic and I know all. So
yes, there we
if anyone
go.
needs some like readings, I'm here.
So the plan here was to stockpile arms and ammunition and use Navy Island as a staging ground for their invasion. The Rensselaer family helped the rebels hire an American merchant ship called the Caroline to smuggle arms and supplies across the river. This worked a couple of times. Almost 500 supporters from both the US and Canada eventually made it to the island, but the upper Canadian government wasn't just going to sit around while a foreign government and a rebel militia built up force on the border.
Yeah.
So a British Navy ship was filled with Canadian militia on December 29th and just sailed over the border,
Easy as that.
landed on US soil, and assaulted the Caroline.
Of course.
The crew and some locals attempted to fend off the attack because they were invading the United States. And in the gunfight that ensued, Amos Durfee, a Black American watchmaker, was hit by a stray bullet and killed. I would say that Amos Durfee's death was the most white America cared about a Black man before 1861, but his death basically vanished in the national press as they blew things further and further out of proportion with rumors of a massacre of the Caroline's crew.
Yeah, no, it's a good way to get like kind of both sides of America on your side.
Yeah. And like locally in the New York area, like in the upstate New York area, Amos Durfee was accurately reported as the only death, and that still galvanized people. They were like, yeah, they came over here and murdered somebody. We need to do something about that.
Well, especially in New York, because New York at the time was very kind of like a lot of anti-slavery.
At this point, they had become one of the more abolitionist states. The Caroline itself was towed out into the river by the British and burnt.
Yeah. That's a sign.
Yeah. Well, responding to the national outrage, Willis Hall, the eternal Jesus,
The Eternal.
the Attorney General of New York, he wrote.
I like the Eternal better personally, but
the Eternal General of New York. It's a very different office.
When Spider-Man's not there, he will come.
We got this guy.
Yeah.
The Eternal General feels like if New York switched to North Korean style juche. But Willis Hall wrote, quote, "Those of our fellow citizens left our territory and united themselves with a foreign power have violated no law. They did no more than Admiral Lord Cochrane did in taking part with South America. They did no more than Lord Byron did, who gave his life to aid the Greeks in breaking the chains of Turkish bondage. They did no more than Lafayette. Gentlemen, I am not deviating from the case further than is necessary to remove the just odium which has been unjustly thrown upon those who joined the insurgents.
That has been really high praise there.
Yeah, you see what he's saying there? Like,
Yeah.
the Rensselaers and the other Americans joining the Canadian Patriots are no different than other foreign militant leaders who joined revolutionary causes, including several famous celebrated Brits and America's all-time favorite Frenchmen.
Yeah, no, Lafayette and Byron are both like worldwide figures.
Yeah, I mean, Lafayette is kind of the face of the wave of Atlantic revolutions. Like, he's involved in all of them.
Lafayette's like probably the most involved that we know about Frenchman in the American Revolution.
Yeah. I mean, he felt like he was George Washington's adopted son. Like
didn't he name he named his son George Washington.
Yes.
George Washington Lafayette is his son's name.
Yeah. And that's the comparison that Willis Hall was making here.
Yeah.
The Caroline incident set the US and Britain right on the brink of war, even more than any of their actual border disputes, because one side's military had pretty blatantly just invaded and attacked the other.
That's like that is like Pearl Harbor right there, just small scale.
There was no outreach to say, hey, stop this civilian ship from arming our rebels. They just crossed an international boundary and lit a boat on fire.
You want something done right, do it yourself.
The British argument was that the Caroline was engaged in piracy, and therefore they had the right to attack it as an enemy of all nations, which was, legally speaking, a stretch.
Yeah, because it was, as far as we know, it was like just kind of sitting there, right?
Yeah, it was ferrying goods back and forth to the rebels, and at the time it was just docked, like it was just tied to a pier.
Yeah, I don't believe Britain here.
That sounds like piracy to me. I don't know.
While all of this was happening, another rebel militia had gathered in London, Ontario, and started to march on Toronto. But they dispersed and fled across the border when they heard about the burning of the Caroline.
Except, never mind.
They were like, oh, maybe this isn't going to happen. All right, we're going to back off for a minute.
Maybe no one noticed that we did that.
Yeah. Without a rebel army to actually assist on the Canadian side, the rebels abandoned Navy Island and most of them fled to the United States, bringing an end to the First Republic of Canada in pretty pathetic fashion.
Yeah,
what the hell?
Well, none of these guys go away, though.
Yeah, I guess the difference is with the last two, it was very much when it ended, those guys were removed out of the picture. Here it just seems like it fizzled out in a way where everyone was like, is that over now?
Well, this one is not over. The man leading the Western Rising in London was Charles Duncombe, another longtime Upper Canada reform politician who reached out to one of his lower Canadian counterparts named Robert Nelson. Nelson had fled the British after the Lower Canadian Revolt and was hiding in Vermont, where he established the Hunters Lodge, a secret society based on the Freemasons and dedicated to the cause of Canadian liberation.
This is two weird societies in one episode.
Yes, it is. It's actually, I think, like 4, but...
Yeah.
So, if I'm understanding this correctly, the rebels, when not getting reinforcements, or they flee to the US in fear of Britain's retaliation.
Yes.
But like they're the ones who invaded America to begin with, right?
I mean, they are fleeing to the US as political refugees. Like, they're not carrying out military actions against the United States. They're just trying to hide here.
Right.
especially with all the border conflicts going on at the time, the US was pretty open to that idea. The fallout of Navy Island was still ongoing when the rebels left. Before the Caroline was burned, they had already sent an American collaborator named Thomas Jefferson Sutherland to Detroit, trying to raise a pro-patriot American militia. And since they already knew that this guy was over there, many of the Navy Island evacuees went to Detroit as well, assuming they'd find a large number of allies. With help from the newly established Hunters Lodges, the Canadian and American militia in Detroit gathered about 400 men. This wasn't huge, but it was enough to scare the local U.S. Army installation, Military Department Number 7, commanded by an old bastard of a military general named Hugh Brady.
Wow. Yeah. That is an American name.
Oh, yeah. Brady grew up in fuck off nowhere, central Pennsylvania, back when it was still a British colony. And he had fought in just about every conflict he could get his hands on since being commissioned into the Continental Army by George Washington.
He is nearly as bloodthirsty as Bailey.
as soon as that Declaration of Independence was signed, he went from like a British accent to just a hardcore American accent.
Yeah,
immediately.
Overnight. It was in his blood. He fought in the Revolution. He fought in the Northwest Confederacy War, the Quasi-War with France, the War of 1812, the Black Hawk War, and several other violent acts of quote-unquote Indian removal.
Some of those are like, they take place like thousands of miles away from each other.
No, he's all over the early United States.
He's frothing at the mouth until he hears gunshots. He's like, okay, here I am.
And also, he doesn't even care what political party starts that war.
He's not in the slightest. He is just a guy who likes wars, but he likes winning them. Major General Brady was so worried about the Patriot militia gathering in his backyard that he actually thought they might seize the local fort, and he had all of the weapons removed and locked up in the Detroit jail.
Okay.
There was just one major flaw in his logic. The Patriots were already living in Detroit. So they attacked the jail and made off with 450 muskets fresh from the U.S. Army.
Why would you put the muskets in jail? I was, as you were saying it, I was like, okay, maybe there's no, it doesn't make any sense at all. Prison break would have been way easier if they had a stash of guns just right around the corner.
Well, next, this Patriot militia went to the local U.S. Marshal's office and either stole or were just given another 200 muskets.
Good. You know what? Sure.
The dice is rolling in their favor.
Yeah, to be clear now, they have almost twice as many guns as people.
That's one per hand.
The World War II Russians could never.
So now that they were armed to the teeth, courtesy of the U.S. government, the Patriots seized control of an armed American sailing ship called the Anne. By armed, I mean they now had cannons.
Which, that is better than having no cannons, that's for sure.
Yeah.
I would say so. I would go so far as to say so.
Yeah. And just to make sure everyone has the picture here, they are sailing around on the Anne in the Detroit River in January.
Okay, a little cold, a little frigid.
The governor of Michigan called up 200 state militia to pursue them in steamships and allowed another 100 Canadian militia to cross the border and join in the chase. But they weren't fast enough. The rebels reached the Canadian Fort Malden, began shelling it and the surrounding town, and conducted amphibious landings.
Oh. That's probably not going to go well then for later on.
No. The Canadian militia opened fire on the Anne and managed to damage the sails enough to run the ship aground. When loyalists boarded the ship, the crew didn't resist, partly because they served as a distraction for the other 300 Patriots to cross back to the U.S. unhindered. Unfortunately, the Canadian militia did confiscate 300 muskets on board, which was a large chunk of the rebel arsenal.
This has actually gotten really big, hasn't it? This is a pretty big thing.
Yeah, this is like thousands of people.
Like, this is like
Yeah.
if you were sitting in office, you'd be like, yeah, there's something happening up there. We have to figure that out.
Uh-huh. The Aroostook War hasn't quite reached its peak of tensions yet, but that's building up at the same time. It really looked like they were going to go to war with England. So the Patriots barely paused to breathe before commandeering another steamship in Detroit. The local militia and the U.S. Marshals tried to confront the Patriots this time, but a crowd gathered and the people of Detroit threatened a riot in support of the Canadian rebels.
Oh my god.
At this point, the U.S. federal government had to intervene and sent 3 companies of the U.S. Army to occupy Detroit and settle things down while the governor negotiated.
This whole series feels to me like a bad D&D game where the dungeon master keeps rolling shitty and has to make something up.
When your DM is also several presidents of the United States. The Patriots basically laughed in the governor's face, then ran off to Dearborn and raided a federal arsenal.
Oh my god!
U.S. Marshals recovered most of those guns in a Detroit tavern a few days later, but by February, the Canadian Patriots in Michigan were just running circles around both governments and raising more and more American public support for a war with the British.
This is hysterical. This is so funny.
Wow.
The entire rest of the episode is just this over and over again. They now had arms caches all over the Detroit region, including on Hickory Island in the Detroit River. Allies within the U.S. Marshals warned them that there was going to be a raid, and Rensselaer Van Rensselaer led 100 men to the island to stop this. Unfortunately, RVR was under the impression that 1,000 friendly militia would arrive from Charles Duncombe's Hunter's Lodge in Cleveland, Ohio, to back him up. When that didn't happen, he just abandoned the arms cache.
Yeah.
You can't trust no RVR. That's the real takeaway.
The thing is, this was a problem, but those 1,000 additional militia did exist.
Where were they?
They wanted to galvanize their American supporters by launching a series of raids on George Washington's birthday, February 22nd.
But he's dead. Like, long dead.
Yeah, but that was like a national holiday.
It was a message. It's like how Trudeau stepped down on January 6th, like
Oh, yeah.
poetic.
Yeah.
Yes. Symbolism.
Yes.
400 patriots from the Hunter's Lodge in Cleveland went to Detroit and joined those patriots on Fighting Island, an ironically named patch of land on the Canadian side of the Detroit River.
Fighting Island.
Yes.
That's an amazing island name.
Simultaneously, another 300 men from Cleveland landed on Pelee Island in Lake Erie.
Ah, terrible. Terrible name.
This is like very close to my mom's hometown of like 400 people. like weirdly close.
I should specify, when I say landed, I mean they walked from Cleveland to this island because the lake was frozen solid.
Ooh. Yeah.
Yeah.
The US and Canada really could not agree on what to do about almost 1,400 partisans occupying 2 border islands. American intelligence somehow had the impression that they only had about 50 muskets between them on Fighting Island and could just be arrested.
They're going to be so disappointed.
The British planned to launch a full assault on the island and declared their intention to pursue them across the border if necessary. Martin Van Buren's government warned that this would be treated as an invasion, because that's what it would be.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Like, just objectively, we said, no, don't send your troops into our country, and you do, that's invading. On the ground in Detroit, Major General Hugh Brady was freaking out and probably remembering the last 2 wars he fought against the British. So he had his troops go plant a bunch of literal red flags in the ice on the Detroit River with orders to shoot any British soldiers that crossed the line.
Okay. So it's like a little standoff.
Yeah. On February 25th, the British launched their assault, shelling and capturing Fighting Island as the Patriot defenders evacuated back to the United States.
This is like a real war. This is like actually happening.
Yeah, no, this was a war. This one is actually a war.
This is insane.
Bailey just figured out that we're having war.
Yeah, no, like it feels like it just keeps escalating, and now we're actually having a battle.
Yeah. The British in this case did the smart thing and did not cross the border. And Brady's men did arrest a few of the Patriots, but with tension so high, they were released just a couple of days later. Over in Lake Erie on Pelee Island, 126 British regulars and a band of Mississauga's First Nations auxiliary troops intercepted 300 Patriots who were attempting to walk back to Ohio.
Where are y'all off to? Ohio. Don't mind us.
The thing is, this was a gruesome little battle. Despite outnumbering the British 2-1, the Patriots were caught in a surprise attack and didn't have any formation.
Wait, the Patriots were on the island, though, right?
No, at this point, both of them were just out on the ice sheet.
Ooh. How do you get ambushed on that ice sheet?
You know, by a bunch of guys in red coats? It's a great question.
It's like, that's oversight. Everyone were crossing this river blindfolded.
I guess what it probably was is that the Patriots are all walking south, so the British are coming from the north. But, like, yeah.
And also, if the British see you first, it's hard to recover from that.
Yeah.
So, like, as much as we laugh, it's more nuanced than that.
But you'd think they'd have somebody, like, looking around.
A scout? Yeah.
With eyes, hopefully.
So the Patriots fired wildly, wounding 25 redcoats, but only killing 5. On the other hand, 14 Patriots were killed, including both of their commanding officers, one of which was a member of the Rensselaer family, and another man who fell through the ice.
Oh, no.
18 of them were wounded.
Imagine being remembered as that guy.
18 of these guys were wounded, most of those seriously enough to die in captivity, when the entire 300-man Patriot militia was captured and taken back to Lower Canada.
But 300 guys, they're supposed to be able to do it, though.
Yeah. So at this point, the Van Buren government started to take things a little more seriously. This is about the time when border tensions between Maine and New Brunswick really escalated, and the U.S. was desperate to avert war. So Winfield Scott was sent with a regiment of the U.S. Army to lock down the New York border, which was what he was doing just before he went to the Aroostook War in the last episode. And Hugh Brady was instructed to crack down on rebel activities in Michigan.
All right.
Throughout the spring of 1838, the U.S. finally got their act together. Thomas Jefferson Sutherland was among those captured on Pelee Island. Rensselaer, Van Rensselaer, and William Lyon Mackenzie were both arrested in the U.S. and charged with violating the Neutrality Act.
No!
This is a law we passed during the quasi-war with France that basically says it's illegal for an American to provide military assistance to a party in another conflict without government approval. The government of Upper Canada started executing rebel leaders captured in the initial wave of uprisings, and for a few months, it looked like the conflict would be winding down. There were a couple of flare-ups in May and June, but these failed to gain the attention and success that unfettered militias marching around Michigan had achieved the previous year.
Right.
This is where we re-enter Charles Duncombe and the Hunters' Lodges. Exiled Canadian political leaders realized that they needed some sort of organizational structure if they wanted to continue the fight. So in September of 1838, Duncombe hosted 160 Upper Canadian delegates at his home lodge in Cleveland. which is where they declared a new Republic of Canada and appointed members to actually form a war cabinet to run the rebel movement.
Okay, guys, you know what? Can I just say, I feel like that this has been a failure, us trying to make our own country. So what I think we should do, and hear me out, don't walk out right away. What if we just restart? Just start it all over again.
Let's just make our. I feel like drink a game for this podcast. If you want to die of alcohol poisoning, do a shot when we make a new country.
If I remember my full tally, I think there are more failed micro republics in this series than episodes. So these elections and basically all Hunter's Lodge activities at this point had to be conducted in absolute secrecy because they were kind of taking their cues from the organization's founder, Robert Nelson. Nelson was that lower Canadian rebel leader hiding out in Vermont who started the lodge. On February 28, 1838, he announced that he was forming a Republic of Lower Canada in exile.
Yay!
And preparing to restart the Canadian Revolt.
All right, another one.
When he made that plan, it sounded like a good idea since more and more British forces were being transferred to the other province. But Nelson made his move too late. The US had already started its crackdown, and he was promptly arrested by the US Marshals.
Useless.
The thing is, a secret Masonic government in exile has a hard time communicating with its soldiers. So the Second Canadian Republic didn't get anything going immediately. However, Americans were getting fired up for war, and they were extremely sympathetic to the Patriot cause. So all of those rebel leaders being charged with the Neutrality Act were acquitted by their juries. By mid-autumn, William Lyon Mackenzie, Rensselaer Van Rensselaer, and Robert Nelson were all back in the field inspiring their militias.
This is like, I'll be honest, all these names coming together, it's starting to feel like the Avengers. The Avengers of this country are coming together to really put a stop to it.
The Canadian Republican Avengers.
Yeah. And it's like Captain America. Which one of them, three of them would be Captain America?
I feel like it's William Lyon Mackenzie, right? Like,
has to be. Yeah, has to be. And he just has a big maple leaf instead of a star on it.
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure Marvel has a Captain Canada. They must by now. So Nelson moved first, launching a raid from Vermont into Lower Canada on November 3rd, only to be promptly beaten back by the British border defenses. However, this was just enough to inspire one last push for a rebellion inside of the colony. 500 armed patriots gathered in the town of Beauharnois with the financial support of the local French-speaking aristocracy. They were dramatically outnumbered, more than 1,000 troops from local militias, and His Majesty's 71st Highlanders were sent to put down the rebellion.
Oof.
Their commander was hung by the neck until dead, 58 of them were deported to Australia, and 50 other captives were just incarcerated in Montreal.
Great.
The British troops in Beauharnois torched several French-speaking businesses on their way out.
Okay.
That's like a slap on the face at the end there.
In part because we're just not talking a ton about the Quebecois side of this in this episode. It's worth pointing out that there was a huge racial or ethnic component to the Lower Canadian Rebellion.
Right.
There was a campaign of forced Anglicization going on.
Yeah.
This rebellion was treated as an excuse for what you could describe as like loose ethnic cleansing. They weren't trying to kill everybody, but they were doing everything in their power to oppress the French speakers along the way.
They don't want to kill everybody, but they do want to kill some. They do want to kill some.
Yeah, they want to make sure that they kill more French-speaking people than English-speaking people.
I don't hate French people. I just don't like French people, man.
Yeah, much like Bailey, they bayed for the blood of the Quebecois.
Nice. My people.
At roughly the exact same time, 250 Hunters Lodge Patriots in upstate New York were preparing their own invasion of Canada, crossing the St. Lawrence River with plans to seize the town of Prescott and the local military base at Fort Wellington. Unfortunately for them, British spies had already passed word of this on to their superiors, and Fort Wellington was ready, firing cannons at the Patriot boats and forcing them to run aground. The rebels fled to a windmill a few miles downriver, and so began the Battle of the Windmill.
Oh, that name.
I guess.
Wow. It's the great naming clause in all of history, where it's like really accurate names of battles.
Yeah, well, and sometimes you're just so in the middle of nowhere, you just go with whatever landmark you've got.
Yeah, but that's when you create the battle of death and despair or something. Something cool. The anguish of sorrow.
I mean, it's like how in music, if you're playing a piece, my teacher used to get me all the time by doing this, being like, what key is this in? And I'm playing sonata in E flat major, and then I'd panic and say something else. It's like, it's in E flat major. Read it. It's simple. It's right there.
Sometimes it's that where you're just tripping up on names. But in this case, this windmill might not be exactly what you're picturing.
Oh, I'm on the edge of my seat.
Gamarjoba. My name is Roberto, and I would like to sincerely thank you for taking the time to check out my podcast, The History of Sakartvelo, Georgia. In all likelihood, I would venture to guess that you found us because you were searching for either podcasts, YouTube videos, blogs about the history of Georgia, or you're hearing this on another podcast, like this one. I'm both sorry and happy to report that this beautiful and fascinating country is, to my great surprise, criminally underrated in the history world. As of now, this is the only podcast I am aware of dedicated to the full history of a nation and a people that have served as the battleground for empires all throughout European and Asian history. But the land of the Kartveli is so much more than that. The birthplace of wine, the second Christian kingdom, the land of fantastic food, nearly superhuman dancers and musicians, and perhaps, most importantly, a people that have preserved their culture, pride, and independence after centuries of one conquest after another. Empires rise and fall, but Sakartvelo always seems to survive in the end. So, let us celebrate this beautiful land by coming with me on this journey from prehistory to the present day, right here at the History of Sakartvelo, Georgia. You can find us on Twitter at history_Georgia. Sakartvelo is spelled Sakartvelo. Now back to your regularly scheduled podcast.
This was a big, old Dutch windmill that might as well have been a castle.
Hell yeah.
It was 18 meters tall on top of a 9-meter hill and built from thick, heavy stones.
Yeah, the Dutch know how to build their windmills, and look at them right now. These are modern, but this is incredible.
Yeah, this provided an excellent view in every direction, and the relatively small field and naval cannons that the British could get within range barely left a dent when they tried shelling the structure.
You like to see that, Yeah, as a rebel leader, you're like, yeah.
Architecture win.
Through the sheer force of coincidence, the Patriots had found themselves a fortress. On the first day, over 1,000 British regulars and militia assaulted the hill, and 18 Patriots died, while a few others suffered minor injuries. 13 British troops were killed, but 70 of them were wounded trying to besiege a windmill.
one entrance, right?
Yeah, one way in, and that will eventually be a problem.
Yeah.
3 whole days passed in a cold standoff as both the American and British Navy sailed in to blockade the river and cut off the escape routes. They had to wait for reinforcements to arrive with the kind of bigger artillery piece you would use to besiege a city before making another attempt.
Wow.
Yeah.
When those guns arrived, they did start to blast away chunks of windmill. A few more British regulars died to rebel sharpshooters, but Patriot casualties skyrocketed. 35 died and almost twice as many were injured.
Is this day 3 or 4? Like, is this, we're getting on now?
This is day 5. Realizing that they were trapped, the Patriot forces surrendered and almost 200 survivors were taken captive. Back in the Detroit area, the Patriot militia was still up to its old tricks. Hugh Brady personally took command of the USS Illinois to capture a Patriot smuggling ship in the Detroit River and confiscate a stockpile of guns and ammunition.
Of course.
When those soldiers got home, they discovered that the Patriots had raided the Detroit City Hall and stolen all of their guns.
Oh my God.
They're really good at this.
At this point, they have practice.
Yeah, like if anything, they are great at just keeping this going.
Right. If these guys had just turned to illegal arms smuggling, they would have been
They would have been rolling in it.
Patriot militias from Pennsylvania and Ohio flooded into Michigan over the next week in preparation for a major offensive across the border, bringing local forces up to some 500 men. At this point, it's hard to know because of the secrecy of the Hunters Lodge, but I am pretty sure that the Canadian Patriot Army was mostly Americans.
Okay. They were just looking for a fight.
Yeah. They wanted to liberate Canada.
And that's a big thing too, because I know when America got its independence, that was a big thing where it's like, well, let's help Canada. And Canada was like, oh, we don't really want help right now. We're pretty happy where we are actually. But I know that when Canada does become its own country, that America does help out quite a lot.
Yeah. This series will actually end with the Treaty of Washington, which was basically a big blanket thing to settle all of the existing grievances and start fresh.
Yeah, and then we'll be starting it again
with a new republic.
The Declaration of Trump, and it'll be undoing it all and restarting.
God. I hate everything. This time, rather than trying to assault a British fort or occupy a Canadian city, the rebels wanted to seize rural territory and run an insurgency. They started by trying to capture the town of Windsor, Ontario, on December 4th, just after 2 a.m.
We're like closer to my mom's hometown. This is the only history that's ever happened there. My first language is French. She is in Ontario. Yeah. I have a feeling we're getting to why that is.
Shout out Windsor. They were the city that everyone was so anti-masks during COVID.
Oh, I knew I recognized their name from something.
A gathering of 10,000 people happened in a national park in Windsor. And over the next few weeks, the rate of deaths in Canada, especially in the Windsor region, skyrocketed. We were having hundreds of people dying a day.
Yep.
Well, if it helps, they were Tories 200 years ago, too. They were not able to breach the town, in part because of bad intelligence. There were only 20 loyalist militia in Windsor, but the 500 Patriot rebels were so preoccupied with attacking the local barracks that they didn't actually take anything else.
20's crazy.
They just lit a bunch of public buildings on fire, including the barracks, and a steamship on their way to set out camp in a nearby orchard. So they arrived at Windsor at 2 a.m. And just before dawn, a random Canadian Militia Patrol was responding to the attack on Windsor and stumbled into this orchard, saw the Patriots, and attacked.
Wow. Unlucky.
Once again, the Patriot side had overwhelming numerical superiority, but they panicked in the dark, and almost 500 rebels ran away from a 60-man militia company.
Here we go.
Panic continued, and the Patriots, they started breaking up into smaller and smaller groups, trying to run away. Rebel hunting continued all day once a British Army colonel named John Prince arrived to take command, and a full company of redcoats wasn't far behind, along with 20 Mississauga auxiliaries acting as a cavalry unit.
So at this point, it seems like the Canadian, quote unquote, Canadian government and the American government are working together against the rebels.
Yes. Like, there is massive public support for the rebels, but the Van Buren administration is desperate to cooperate with the British on anything right now to avert a wider war.
It should also be stated that at this point, I believe America is going through its first economic crash. So that's also why they wouldn't want to have a war with Britain.
It was a terrible time to have a war.
Yeah.
So shockingly, most of the rebels actually escaped, completely exhausted by late afternoon. A few of them were caught by an American Navy patrol and released on US soil. Again, there's that public sentiment thing. Only 25 rebels were killed in combat and about 50 were captured. But John Prince decided to make the Battle of Windsor a final example to the rebellion. 4 rebel officers were summarily executed almost as soon as they were in custody, and Prince had 7 more lined up for a firing squad before local businessmen convinced him to stand down before he made martyrs.
Yeah. It's one thing killing off the leaders, but if you start killing off the people who are involved, their friends and their family will start being like, okay, no, not
Yeah.
This is what is wrong with the government. So let's go.
You've solved it.
I have. If I was there, we would have had another country.
Yes. You would be the president of the Republic of Canada.
The 4th one.
So despite this intervention, it didn't save everyone. In 1838 and 1839, if you were a Patriot officer who fell into British custody, hanging was almost guaranteed. Any lower-ranking militiamen who could be tied to specific incidents were usually sentenced to transportation, either to Australia or Tasmania, including almost 100 Americans by the time it was all said and done. This is why Australia is so cool, is because these are the people who did war crimes there. The last Battle of Windsor was the straw that broke the camel's back and the final rebel offensive in the Patriots' War. Hunters' lodges on the American side continued to try and organize, but the Van Buren administration ordered the military and the federal marshals to come down hard on insurgents operating in the U.S. Simultaneously, though, the Battle of Windsor was just a few weeks before the Battle of Caribou with the Bears.
Oh, yes.
So tensions between the U.S. and Britain were still sky high. The U.S. Army even constructed 2 new forts in Michigan to prepare for a British invasion.
And it makes sense why like a lot of people were worried, because the last 3 stories you were told us, they've all happened generally around the same time and also generally in the same region.
I am pretty sure that if the Canadian rebels had managed to hold out for about 6 more months before starting something, there probably would have been a war.
Right.
Like, if some of these Patriot raids were overlapping with the Aroostook buildup in Maine, there was too much support for it in the U.S. for that not to have escalated, especially as Van Buren was looking at an election year. Like, I think they would have been stuck with it.
Yeah.
So in the year that followed, several British officials, including Lord Durham, a proponent of British electoral reform, and Lord Elgin, the son of the more famous Parthenon marbles thief, were sent to Canada to try and figure out what the hell was going on.
Is everyone upset? Why is everyone so upset here? What's going on?
Durham was very sympathetic to the rebels' motivations because he was campaigning for similar reforms in the UK. And the resulting Durham report called for two things, broadly speaking: greater colonial autonomy in Upper Canada, and doing everything in Britain's power to eliminate French identity in the colonies to make the people there more English, because the English were a superior race.
Oh,
That's terrible.
okay. Crazy take.
Fun fact about Durham, though, this is the guy who now an entire 4 or 5 city stretch of a school region is called the Durham region in Ontario. So there's the York region, which is after someone else, and then there's Durham, which is another region with a collection of cities in it.
Yeah, I mean, like, that makes sense. He is a major factor in like getting Canada towards being its own country. Ridiculous anti-French racism aside, like, he did campaign for there to be more civil rights in general.
Yeah, you can be an impactful character or an impactful person, but still be terrible.
Yeah.
Yep.
In 1840, this resulted in the Canadian Acts of Union, merging Upper and Lower Canada into just the province of Canada, and encouraging more British settlement in the colony to eliminate the French-speaking majority. Lord Elgin's recommendation to soothe things may be more surprising. He called for amnesty for all of the rebel leaders still living in the United States, and this was actually passed by the new United Canadian Legislature.
There's no point in keeping up a witch hunt.
Most people didn't take him up on this.
Oh. Yeah.
Charles Durham went west and got involved in California politics. Robert Nelson just retired and moved to Staten Island.
Hell yeah.
William Lyon Mackenzie actually liked what he saw in the new Canada and went home to his wife and their horde of children in 1849.
Horde.
There were 13 of them!
That's a lot of...
That is a lot.
That's so many kids!
If you have that many kids, one of them's bound to, like, have another kid who's going to be prime minister. Like, the odds are already stacked in your favor.
He was reelected to the legislature and eventually became the mayor of Toronto.
Yep.
With continued electoral support, or with continued support for electoral reform for the rest of his life.
I'll be honest, I always thought that was King. That was the mayor of Toronto, not him.
I think they both might have been.
Oh, okay, because I knew one of them at least was the mayor of Toronto, but I always assumed it was King, not this guy.
Again, it's so weird to have these two guys overlap, and one of them inciting incident to his life and career was the defeat of Napoleon, and the other led Canada through the Second World War. Like, those are not things that are supposed to...
And that's like yeah.
There's no string between those things.
Yeah, like, the only thing that most people think about when they think of both of those is the German-French border. Like...
Yeah.
In between the end of the Patriots War and that general amnesty, the US and Britain settled most of their disputes with the Webster-Ashburton Treaty. In addition to dealing with the disputed border, the treaty also addressed how the two powers should handle things like rebel forces from one or the other operating in their territory going forward. And most of this remains in effect between the US and Canada today, like the provision that although the newly defined boundary ran through the middle of the Great Lakes, both countries would be allowed to sail through all of the lakes unimpeded. It also defined the 7 great crimes that either side could demand extradition for: murder or assault with intent to commit murder, piracy, arson, robbery, forgery, or the utterance of forged papers.
So forgery and fraud.
Yeah.
Right.
Of course.
Utterance.
That basically covers all of the big issues that might come up in a rebellion.
Yeah.
There was still one issue to address from this episode, though. Extradition is great for enforcing state power after the fact, but what do you do in the moment? The Caroline incident from 1837 was still a hot-button issue, and its exaggeration in American newspapers was one of the driving factors toward the almost war. The Webster-Ashburton negotiations eventually led to the so-called Caroline test. The British argued that crossing the border and seizing a ship on the American side was an act of self-defense. Webster argued that self-defense could only be justified if the threat was instant, overwhelming, leaving no choice of means and no moment for deliberation, and that they did nothing unreasonable or excessive, since the act, justified by the necessity of self-defense, must be limited by that necessity.
Yeah, I guess when it's between two countries, then yeah. Between two people, no.
No, this is for between state powers.
Yeah.
This test was formulated in 1842 and became a cornerstone of international law, which was used as legal precedence in the Nuremberg trials in 1945.
Whoa!
Weird.
The Caroline test is one of the underpinning foundational pieces of legal precedence that governs how modern countries conduct wars with one another.
Wow.
Wow.
The use of force must be necessary because the threat is imminent, and pursuing peaceful alternatives is not an option. That response must be proportionate to the threat. The shorthand for this is sometimes called the doctrine of instant and overwhelming necessity.
This is why I did not think we would be ending with the Nuremberg trial.
Hitler came up a lot in this episode.
I know it's like a running gag that, like, in history circles, like, how long can you have a conversation before someone brings up Hitler? But, like...
This is the legal theory of the Nuremberg trials. Like, it comes from this.
Yeah.
Hey, History of Persia fans. Before Persia, another civilization controlled the Middle East, the very first civilization, the inventors of writing itself. From the clay tablets of ancient Mesopotamia come the oldest stories. The history and myth of the first Mesopotamians is the subject of the Oldest Stories podcast online at oldeststories.net. If you like ancient history, come check out the Oldest Stories after you listen to this episode.
The history of Persia is intertwined with conquest. It began with conquest when Cyrus, king of a small city called Anshan, set out to build the greatest empire the world had ever seen. In a series of stunning campaigns, he achieved just that, becoming one of the greatest conquerors in history, and basically started Persian history. After all, you don't get the title the Great for nothing. But he wouldn't be the last great Persian conqueror. Other Persian rulers like Darius the Great, Mithridates I, and Ardashir I would go on to become great conquerors on their own, establishing their own great empires and legacies. If you want to hear their story, and the stories of other great conquerors, many of whom are far less famous despite their great achievements, join me, Ramzi Shalah, on my podcast, The Conquerors Podcast, available on all platforms you listen through.